Hi, my name's Michelle Haywood and I'm standing for the constituency of Rushen.
Now, Michelle, we're going to talk a little bit about your local authority background in a moment. But first of all, you stood for the Legislative Council last year, clearly then keen to get out of local politics.
I don't think it's getting out of local politics necessarily. And if the elections had timed out differently, I would have cheerfully stood when the local elections should have come round last April. Or April before, in fact. But actually, it's keen to make more of a contribution and to make more of a difference.
So making a difference, I think, at a higher level is something you've been quoted as saying.
Yeah.
I wonder what that says about the role and even need for commissioners now then.
Oh, and I think commissioners are really, really valuable. I think the link between the local residents and how they're governed, even on a minimal level, which is a lot of local authorities we're dealing with when the streetlights are turned on and when the bins are emptied and what the recycling policy is and keeping the beach clean of seaweed and dog bylaws and things like that. But actually having that link so that you've got local representation is really, really important, and I would never try and take that away.
How well would you say then you understand the difference between what the role of an MHK is as opposed to a role of a commissioner?
I think it's funny because you reference a sort of like Legco, and I spent a lot of time before I was prompted to stand for Legco, sort of sitting there considering the difference. I spend a lot of time working with government departments and with civil servants and with politicians developing policies and developing strategies elsewhere. So I think I've got a reasonably good idea about the sort of the big step between, and there is a bit of a gulf between the two roles. I can see that, but equally I think it's the chance to have that input at a high level, so it's not policy handed down to local authorities, but you're actually having the chance to influence that before it leaves government.
So just talk me through your local authority background. You were elected, was it 2016?
Yeah, 2016 went in on the ballot in the general election then, and in 2018 I was elected chair, so from within the commissioners I became the chair then.
Now, the future of local government, I think it was a pretty frequent phrase in previous elections. We're not hearing it quite so much now. What's your view on the future of local authorities in the Isle of Man?
I think that there's contrasting views here. It's surprising that we have two tiers of government, because actually for a population of around 84,000 people, that's quite a lot of governance. However, I'm a huge fan of local government and local representation. And so I think marrying those, what you actually need to look at is making local authorities more of almost an outpost for government, so that you use town halls, say, as hubs for government services, and that actually for your residents, they see that as their access point. We've seen, with potential loss of post offices, that you can't access services as easily. Why are we not creating hubs there with members of staff who can help those who don't have internet access and a computer at home to tax their car, to update their driving licence, or whatever it is that needs doing. And I'd love to see local authorities and government working closer together in that way, so that actually it's not all Douglas-centric. Equally, I think that there's some efficiencies that could be made across local government. The concept of having a clerk within each local government area that is responsible for HR and staffing issues and policy and delivering all those, it's actually an awful lot to come under one person, for them to be responsible financially and have local authority housing that they're looking after. And I think recently Portsmouth joined the Southern Shared Housing List, and that's actually, it's all centrally set policies, but you've got a local housing officer who knows the residents delivering it. And I think there's scope for looking for more savings like that, so that HR doesn't have to be every clerk that's HR trained. It could be one clerk that's providing those HR services across a number of local authorities, and that would allow some savings to come through, but also give you a better chance to improve the service that you deliver.
And have you had any of those conversations in your position as chair up to now?
We've had the conversations drift around. Be aware down in Portsmouth, the discussions over whether they should be a twin port with Port Erin is always present. And both towns do have their own individual identity, and both are quite proudly independent of each other. But I think there is scope for working more closely together, certainly.
And in your experience, what's the relationship been like between Portsmouth commissioners and government?
We are generally quite good. We've got reasonably good working links with those departments that we need to, although we've been a little bit chastened recently. We've been pushing for a long time. The High Street in Portsmouth area is collapsing as a result of when the IRIS scheme was put through. That's been going on for ages. We have huge potholes forming, and we've been told by the DOI again and again and again, yes, it's on the list and it's been pushed back, it's on the list and it's been pushed back. And then our current MHK, Dewan Watson, put in an information request about projects that had been deferred for funding from DOI, and it turns out our project was never on it. So we're a little bit confused at the moment, because we did think we had a good working relationship, but obviously that's not the case. And I think it's very hard for local authorities. We push things as hard as we can, but then when you get almost stonewalled by the government departments, it's really hard to make progress beyond that.
So is this where maybe, Michelle, you think you might have a little bit more power and influence if you were on the inside? You're going to make some promises to the people of Rushen about things like this?
I think there is definite scope for a more sensible way of working. We see time and again that government exists in its own separate legal entities, and little silos, and people defend their own little fiefdom. And I understand that people are reluctant to deal with change. However, there is clearly scope for a more joined up, more open and transparent way of working. And that always doesn't come from the politicians, but it comes from the civil servants as well. So ministers leading departments have a clear responsibility to put that ethos through into their staff as well.
Now, just talking about change, in the letter from Lawrence Skelly proposing you for LegCo last year, he said that you had steered considerable cultural change within the town hall. What did he mean by that?
We've gone for zero-based budgeting, so it's no longer a get to the end of the year and everyone sticks their favourite projects on the table and we have a guess at numbers. We've gone for evidence-based decision-making in a big way, and my background is that I'm scientific and research orientated, so actually I like the facts there. I like to know what the costs are, what the benefits are, what the downsides are before I'm even going to sign up to a decision. So we've changed the culture a little bit in terms of fact-finding before anyone votes with their heart, and it's dead easy to vote with your heart sometimes, though when you evaluate the facts, that's not going to help your situation. We've put in place a lot more sensible policies in terms of how staff recruitment and things like that are managed, so our staff are clear about what their roles are and what they can expect from us. And so it's made it a more comfortable place to work, and it's made it easier for the public to deal with everyone because they know what they're expecting for us. Even simple things like a complaints policy wasn't in place, and that is now in place. And so if you do have something that goes wrong, and everyone gets stuff wrong occasionally, and nobody's ever denying that we don't, if you do have something goes wrong, you're quite clear about what your expectations are for response times and who's going to talk to you about it. So we're not trying to brush things under the carpet. And it really is about an open and sort of honest dialogue with the residents.
How would you describe your management style?
I'd like to think I'm fairly friendly, but firm. Very often I think I can often see where I think things should be heading fairly quickly in a conversation, and often I have to come back to leading people through those steps, and I'm quite used to sort of basically disinterring my argument and working through so that hopefully that you're carrying people along with you, and that it's not about charging away and expecting everyone to follow. I'm happy to lead from the front. I wouldn't do anything that I wasn't expecting. I wouldn't ask anyone else to do something that I wouldn't do myself, because I don't think that would be at all fair. So I think sometimes you have to step up and lead the way.
You said something interesting about taking ownership of mistakes a couple of minutes ago, and it is something you've said about government needing to take clear responsibility for its decisions and have the humility to admit mistakes and work to resolve problems. Could you give me an example of when you've done that in your leadership position?
Yes, there are times where I big fan of trying to reduce the amount of grass cutting that we have going on in Portsmouth, because we tend to get to the summer just as the wildflowers are all coming out and then chop the hell out of them. And so I did first go, well, I know that's it, we need to just stop that entirely and things. And then that was really my heart speaking, but also my sort of like environmental side going, well, we've just got to let things seed. And the workmen came back to us and they said, yes, but there's problems with access at this point, and there's problems with vision down the road if we allow this to overgrow. And so it was almost like stepping back and refining that. And I had to say, I'm sorry, I did say we weren't going to cut these, but we need to. And there's justifiable reasons. And I think if you can find those, even if somebody comes up to you afterwards and you might have publicised a decision, but if it was wrong, being able to turn around and go, right, now I've found out this, I recognise that I may have overstepped what I said, and actually I'd like to dial back, and we'll do what we can elsewhere. So it's just tailoring things really, and being able to say it's fine, I won't get it right every time. I don't think anyone who pretends to is even sane.
I mean, that's an interesting thing, and I'm not sure, to be fair, whether we're really used to seeing politicians being like that over here.
No, but if you're not like that, and then people see that things are going wrong and you don't ever admit to it, you lose credibility, you lose people's trust in you. And when you are trying to then make even harder decisions in the future, where you might have got it you may have got it right and called it right on the facts and the evidence, people aren't going to trust those decisions either. And I think it does come down to an element of how that relationship builds, doesn't it?
Let's talk a little bit about your vision for the Isle of Man. One of the things you say is that it should be sustainable. Tell me what exactly that means in practice.
See, bigger than we currently talk about at the moment. So we talk about the biosphere, and if you go onto the Isle of Man government website, it says biosphere, and it's all about sustainability. And when you look into that, what that actually means, it's 3 or 4 projects. It's some marine nature reserves. It's not dredging scallops all year round. It's whatever it is, but it's nothing that is long term recognisable. If you took the UN version of what does sustainability mean, and the UN set 17 sustainable development goals, and those goals include ending poverty and ending hunger, and decent housing and decent education and equality, and it includes working together across private sector and third sector charities as well, so that actually the whole thing is about everyone advancing forward together. And it's way beyond it. Climate change is in there, and I'm not not saying that that's not a critical factor, but actually it's so much more than that. And sustainability is about carrying everyone with you on that journey rather than leaving sectors of the society behind. And we've seen, in the last couple of years, that there's a clear disadvantage to being on 0 hours contracts. That when companies are shut down, then that is it, and people struggling to pay their rent and struggling. We've seen rent arrears rising all the time, because what we created is a society where 0 hours contracts are acceptable way of working. And that shouldn't be the case, because that's not sustainable in the long term. It doesn't give anyone security. It doesn't give anyone the ability even to try and apply for a mortgage, because you have got nothing to evidence what your earnings are likely to be. And we need to move away from those bits that we've seemed to have allowed creep in that really won't serve us well in the long term.
So if you were voted in as one of the Rushen MHKs, what would you do about that?
Particularly about 0 hours contracts, there are certain circumstances when I think they're appropriate. I've done some work for the Department of Education where I invigilate exams, and it's fine that that's a 0 hours contract. It's not a key part of anything that I do, and if those hours pop up and I'm available, that's fine. But if you've got people who are on 0 hours contracts who are expected to work week in, week out, we need to change the legislation so that the companies that they are working for have to regularise that. I've just been working, I'm on the Southern Swimming Pool Board, and we've been working there because if you teach swimming lessons, you only teach them during term times, and that means that you're on an irregular income as well, and you're not quite sure what the hours are. So we've shifted to let's balance that out across the year, let's give people proper contracts, and let's give people some security about what their earnings will be. Although their hours might be shuffled a little bit, it means that actually they can plan financially, and that's really important.
So I suppose I ask the question again, is if you were elected in September, what would you do to try and get that change in a broader sense?
In a broader sense, I think it's about changing employment legislation, but it's also then about the discussions with the companies that are working in that way, and finding that common ground with them so that they understand that it's not in their own interest. Because we're starting to see now a little bit of a recruitment crisis in hospitality, for example, because people who've been on those uncertain contracts have found something else to do. And so once you start opening up hospitality, it's not in those companies' interest that they had people who are on 0 hours contracts that don't want to come back because they found something permanent. And so I think businesses are starting to recognise that 0 hours contracts are generally a bad idea for them too. So I think you have to work across not only government but also with the companies involved to make the change happen for everyone.
And is that something you would drive through
Yes.
if elected? Let's just talk about a local issue. You touched on it a little bit earlier, and that is the post office in Port St Mary. Towards the end of last year, its future was in the headlines. The commissioners held an emergency meeting. Consultation was launched, and you were quoted as saying that they were consulting on something that they'd already decided. Now, we know that as much as post offices are valuable to certain members of the community, not everyone uses them now. Michelle, if something isn't financially viable, and you are a businesswoman as well, what is the justification in propping it up for the few?
I think post offices, as the post office strategy's gone, it looks very much at income and it looks at the expenditure and the cost and things, and that's fine. What we fail to do when we look at those post offices is look at the social capital, the social value to having that hub there. Now, actually, I think this is one of those places where local authorities should be stepping together with the post office and providing those hub services in a building that is subsidised by the ratepayers, obviously, and it would be, perhaps needs some subsidy from government to make it happen, but actually recognising that those services provide a useful point of contact for all sorts of people. And the post office consultation that was run, they were very proud of themselves because they had lots of 17, 18, 19-year-olds who took part in their consultation. And of course, that generation were absolutely fine to do all these services online because they probably can sit there and do it off their smartphone before you've even finished telling them which app they were meant to be looking at. They'll have clicked through and paid and job's done. However, particularly for Port St Mary, when you've got a population that's very much older and has less access to those services, you risk disadvantaging them enormously by taking away the personal counter stuff. And we saw during the COVID lockdown, when it was one of the few shops that was open in Port St Mary, that it did act, even though you were only 2 people in and allowed at a time, it did act as a little bit of a focus, and it was a possibility to check up on people and to check well-being. So I think, although the Tynwald strategy that was approved for the post office is focused entirely on financials, what it missed was the social value for those things. And there are parts of what government does that almost have to be subsidised because they have a social value.
They have to be subsidised, but something else might have to go in order to provide that subsidy, because we are in a time where finances are strained.
We are, and there is always a balancing act to be had. And, if you had unlimited finances, every pothole would be repaired and there'd be no waiting list at the hospital. And that clearly isn't going to happen. Well, not that pace anyway. But I think by being smart about where you offer those services and whether you could offer them through local hubs and whether that's a shared facility with other places, the post office are very prescriptive, and partly because of the financial regulations they worked on, very prescriptive and very tight about who could sell you a stamp or who could deal with your vehicle tax. And so I think there needs to be some careful look at that to say, well, actually, would it be appropriate for an admin officer in a town hall to be able to do that particular task? They actually handle money from local housing residents and stuff anyway. So it's not a step beyond the imagination to see that with a bit of creative thinking you can probably keep those services within communities, but in a more cost effective way.
It is interesting though, because you do want to see the Isle of Man being more progressive, and in some ways that's a big mindset to change. And when you're talking about holding on to things which possibly don't have or soon won't have much of a place in the future, that's not a terribly progressive way of thinking.
I disagree. I think progression comes about taking everyone with you as well, not about leaving certain sectors behind. No, we could all be progressive. If we all had fibre broadband, it'd all be fantastic. That's not going to happen for many regions on the Isle of Man for months to come yet. And we have to accept that there are a generation that will not access services that way. And it's absolutely desperately unfair of us to leave that sector behind. And progression doesn't happen if you start disenfranchising parts of your society. So we need to find a way of bringing them with us. And if that means that your post office services are provided in a coffee shop, because actually that reduces the rent that's needed for the space for the post office counter, and it is somebody operating a smart unit or whatever that allows that to happen, then that's what we need to think about. We can use technology to actually make things better, even for those that don't necessarily access the technology themselves. We just have to find a way of doing it.
So, Michelle Haywood, you have around 30 seconds to speak to the people of Rushen and tell them why you deserve one of their votes in September.
I consciously moved to the Isle of Man 15 years ago. I've been really fortunate to bring up my family here. I love the island. I love its people. I love the sense of community. Absolutely fantastic place to live and work. I think I've made a difference in Portsmouth. I think I've managed to bring through sensible change that has settled things down and certainly more of a steady hand on the tiller and actually smooth things out so that it works better. And I want to step up to doing that at a higher level. I want to make things work better. I want to solve some of the inequalities and equally look to the future, because actually we have some serious challenges to face.
Michelle Haywood, thank you.